Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: in Cyprus, Canadian soldiers await potential orders for evacuation of citizens in Lebanon. EU calls for humanitarian pauses for Gaza aid as Israel raids enclave. Officers are flooding into Maine during the desperate manhunt for armed and dangerous Lewiston suspect. Joe Biden warns Iran against targeting U.S. troops in the Middle East. Unsafe, unprofessional, Chinese jet came within meters of U.S. B-52, says Pentagon. In Cyprus, Canadian soldiers await potential orders for evacuation of citizens in Lebanon. The Globe and Mail. Canada has deployed more than 300 soldiers to Cyprus in preparation for the possibility of evacuating over 150,000 Canadians from Lebanon. The move comes amid a growing fear that a skirmish between Israel and Hamas in Gaza will escalate into a full-blown war, potentially necessitating the evacuation of Canadian citizens. The soldiers are currently stationed in a hotel in Cyprus, monitoring satellite imagery of Beirut airport and port, the likely staging grounds for an evacuation. The Canadian government has ordered the soldiers to be ready to respond to an evacuation at short notice, and to be stationed near Cyprus, Athens, and Beirut. The Canadian government has stated that it could evacuate citizens within 6 hours, but this would depend on decisions made in each country's capital. A total of 20 countries have sent staff to Cyprus to prepare for the evacuation of their citizens, and each country has representation at the Xenon Coordination Center, a Cypriot facility that allows countries to coordinate their evacuations. EU calls for humanitarian pauses for Gaza aid as Israel raids enclave. Reuters. European Union leaders have urged for pauses in Israeli bombing and Hamas rocket attacks in order to allow humanitarian aid to be delivered to Gaza. This comes as Israel prepares for a ground incursion into the area and as Palestinian militants clash with Israeli troops near the border. The 27 EU leaders have reached a compromise declaration expressing their gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and calling for continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Officers are flooding into Maine during the desperate manhunt for armed and dangerous Lewiston suspect. Yahoo! The manhunt is underway for Robert Card, a U.S. Army reservist, suspected of being the gunman behind a mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. The shooting left 18 dead and 13 injured. Hundreds of investigators and officers are searching for Card, who is considered to be armed and dangerous. A note was discovered at the suspect's home during a search warrant being executed there. Investigators are now trying to determine the meaning of the note and how it could potentially guide their investigation. Card is a petroleum supply specialist in the Army Reserve. He had recently reported mental health issues, including hearing voices and threats to shoot up the National Guard base in Saco, Maine. Card was armed with an AR-15 style rifle when he killed 6 men and 1 woman at the Just-in-Time bowling alley. He then murdered 8 men at the Skiminji's Bar and Grill. Both locations are in Lewiston. Joe Biden warns Iran against targeting U.S. troops in the Middle East. South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden has sent a rare message to Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warning Tehran against targeting U.S. personnel in the Middle East, the White House said on Thursday after a spate of attacks on American forces in the region. Iran's mission to the United Nations did not immediately respond to a request for comment. U.S. officials want to avoid a wider conflict in the Middle East following the October 7 attack by the militant Hamas group on Israel that killed at least 1,400 people, mostly civilians. Unsafe, unprofessional, Chinese jet came within meters of U.S. B-52, says Pentagon. The Sydney Morning Herald. The U.S. military has accused a Chinese jet of flying dangerously close to a U.S. bomber over the South China Sea earlier this week. The Chinese J-11 jet allegedly came within 3 meters of the B-52 aircraft and flew in an unsafe and unprofessional manner. The incident is part of a pattern of what the U.S. has called increasingly risky behavior by Chinese military aircraft. The Pentagon has previously stated that Chinese military aircraft have carried out maneuvers close to U.S. aircraft nearly 200 times since 2021. The incident comes amid tense relations between China and the U.S. over a range of issues. Palestinians plead stop the bombs at UN meeting but Israel insists Hamas must be obliterated. Associated Press. The ongoing war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas was discussed at an emergency meeting at the United Nations yesterday. Arab nations are expected to propose a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. This comes after 4 failed attempts by the Security Council to agree on any action regarding the ongoing violence. Yesterday's meeting saw speaker after speaker back the Arab resolution ceasefire call, except for Israel's UN ambassador Gilad Erdan, who said that a ceasefire means giving Hamas time to rearm itself so they can massacre us again. The UN's emergency meeting, which has over 100 speakers remaining, will resume this morning. The resolution being proposed calls for an immediate ceasefire and demands that all parties respect international law and protect civilians. The resolution also states that essential goods, such as food and medicine, should be provided to Gaza and calls on Israel to rescind its order for Gazans to move from the north to the south. Nowhere safe, in southern Gaza, a scramble in vain to outrun the war. Washington Post. As the conflict between Israel and Palestine rages on, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Palestinians in Gaza to find somewhere safe to take refuge. Israel had previously advised the people of Gaza to move south for their own safety. However, this area has now become a target for Israeli airstrikes. The Israeli Defense Forces have intensified their attacks on Hamas in the south, killing over 7,000 Palestinians since the start of the war. The death toll is still rising as new reports emerge of attacks on residential areas in Gaza. The situation is becoming increasingly desperate for the people of Gaza, as they face dwindling supplies of water, food and fuel. Humanitarian aid is now only trickling into the area. Gazans trying to find a safe place to stay are now abandoning hope. One resident says that there is nowhere safe in Gaza. The UN Relief and Works Agency has been donating flour to the only remaining bakery in Maghazi refugee camp. However, this bakery was destroyed in an Israeli airstrike on Wednesday. Rick Scott calls for Biden administration to revoke Iran foreign minister's visa. Yahoo! Senator Rick Scott, Republican Florida, has called for President Biden to revoke the visa of Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian after he made threats against the United States in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly. Scott urged Biden to take action, stating that the U.S. cannot tolerate threats from terror sponsors. He also reposted a clip of Abdollahian warning that the U.S. would not be spared from the fire of war in the region if the war in Gaza continues. Scott has previously warned about the risk of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil and has introduced legislation to freeze $6 billion in assets set to be transferred to Iran as part of a prisoner exchange. Ukraine's counteroffensive has been slow, but Western support remains strong even with new war in Middle East. Yahoo! The fighting in eastern Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia has reached a stalemate, with neither side making significant gains and the war settling into trench warfare. The U.S. has promised to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but recent events in the U.S., such as the chaos on Capitol Hill and the possibility of a second Donald Trump presidency, have raised concerns about the future of U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Cold weather will soon freeze both armies in Eastern Europe in place, and large-scale operations are not expected to resume until the spring. So far, Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia has had only modest gains, and some experts argue that Ukraine would be better off staying on the defense and wearing down Russia's will. However, Ukraine has had success targeting Russia's Black Sea Fleet and positions in Crimea, and its long-term plan is to push Russia out of the Crimean Peninsula and other occupied parts of Ukraine's coastline. Russia, meanwhile, has launched an offensive of its own in the southeast Donetsk region, and the conflict is expected to continue in the coming months. First FT, 8 Indians sentenced to death in Qatar on charges of spying for Israel. Financial Times. 8 Indian former naval officers have been sentenced to death by Qatar after being found guilty of spying on the country's submarine program for Israel. The Indian government said it was exploring all legal options in response to the verdict. Hello, viewers. I'm Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, bringing you the latest news from around the globe. Let's dive into today's headlines. In Cyprus, Canadian soldiers are on standby, ready to evacuate over 150,000 Canadians from Lebanon, should the conflict between Israel and Hamas escalate further. The soldiers are stationed in a hotel, monitoring the situation and preparing for a potential evacuation. It's like a real-life game of ready or not, but with higher stakes. Meanwhile, the European Union is calling for humanitarian pauses in the bombing and rocket attacks in Gaza, in order to allow aid to reach the people in need. It's like a game of freeze tag, but instead of freezing for fun, it's freezing for life-saving aid. In the U.S., a desperate manhunt is underway for a suspected gunman behind a mass shooting in Maine. It's like a twisted game of hide and seek, where the stakes are life and death. U.S. President Joe Biden issued a rare warning to Iran, cautioning them against targeting U.S. personnel in the Middle East. It's like a game of stop, or I'll say stop again. The U.S. military has accused a Chinese jet of flying dangerously close to a U.S. bomber over the South China Sea. It's like a game of chicken, but with fighter jets. Talk about high stakes. The war between Israel and Hamas was discussed at an emergency meeting at the United Nations. Arab nations are calling for a ceasefire, but Israel insists on the complete obliteration of Hamas. It's like a game of tug-of-war, but with bombs and lives hanging in the balance. In southern Gaza, Palestinians are desperately trying to find somewhere safe to take refuge, as the conflict continues to escalate. It's like a tragic game of musical chairs, where there's nowhere safe to sit. Senator Rick Scott is calling for the visa of Iran's foreign minister to be revoked, after he made threats against the United States. It's like a game of red light, green light, where the US is saying, "Stop, you're not welcome here." The fighting in eastern Ukraine has reached a stalemate, with neither side making significant gains. It's like a never-ending game of trench warfare, where the only winners are the ones who survive. And finally, 8 Indian former naval officers have been sentenced to death in Qatar for spying on the country's submarine program for Israel. It's like a real-life game of spyfall, with deadly consequences. Now, let's hear from you, my dear viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any questions or insights to share? I'm all ears. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.